In this tutorial I will give an overview of Raspberry Pi, how you can install Raspberry Pi and install it and set it up remotely for remote access. So this is the content of this tutorial. First, a short introduction to Raspberry Pi. Then I will use the Raspberry Pi imager in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on the micro SD card. I'll also show the advanced options that you can use in combination with the Raspberry Pi imager. I will show how you can use PuTTy, how you set up VNC, and finally how you can remotely control the Raspberry Pi using remote desktop connection. Or an alternative to remote desktop connection is VNC Viewer, which I also will show how you install and how you can use. So first, a short introduction. So this tutorial we will install the Raspberry Pi operating system on the Raspberry Pi using this Raspberry Pi imager. And if you have a monitor and a micro HDMI to HDMI cable, which you need in order to connect the Raspberry Pi to an external monitor, and if you have a keyboard and a mouse, you are now ready to start using Raspberry Pi. If you have installed the Raspberry Pi operating system using Raspberry Pi imager and then put in the micro SD card into the Raspberry Pi, so now you are ready to start using the Raspberry Pi. But assume that you don't have an external monitor, you don't have an extra keyboard or a mouse that you want to use for your Raspberry Pi. So then in this tutorial I will show and demonstrate how to set up and use the Raspberry Pi remotely. So then I will use the advanced options in the Raspberry Pi imager, and then I will set up SSH, Wi-Fi, etc. And then in the next step we can use the PuTTy software to get remote terminal access to the Raspberry Pi. And then we can use PuTTy to configure the Raspberry Pi by enabling VNC and make it ready for using the Raspberry Pi remotely using remote desktop connection. And as mentioned, we will also show an alternative using this VNC Viewer. So basically that's the contents of this tutorial. So let's start with a short overview of the Raspberry Pi. So here you see the Raspberry Pi hardware. It has a power supply port, USB-C. You can connect two external monitors using micro HDMI. It has 4 USB ports, it has an Ethernet port, and it has general purpose input-output pins here. You can also connect a camera. So basically this is the Raspberry Pi, and in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system you need a micro SD card that you put into the back on the Raspberry Pi. So typically this is what you need. You need of course a Raspberry Pi, you need a micro SD card, and typically you need a micro SD adapter in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on the micro SD card from your computer. And then you need a USB power supply, and if you want to connect your Raspberry Pi to a monitor, of course you will need a monitor and you will need an external keyboard and a mouse. But in this tutorial I will show you how you can install and set up and use the Raspberry Pi remotely from your computer. So basically Raspberry Pi operating system is the operating system that you need installed in order to use the Raspberry Pi. This Raspberry Pi operating system is Linux based, and you need a micro SD card in order to install the operating system using this Raspberry Pi imager. So then let's start with this Raspberry Pi imager. So here you see the Raspberry Pi imager is basically a small software that you need to install on your PC in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on the micro SD card. So basically it's very simple to use. You just choose the operating system. Typically you use the default operating system, which is Raspberry Pi operating system 32-bit. So that's the default choice, but you can also choose between other operating system. Then you need to insert a SD card into your computer and then select that SD card in this option. And then finally you just click on the right button in order to install this Raspberry Pi operating system on the micro SD card. And then you can just, when this is finished, you just put the micro SD card into the Raspberry Pi hardware, and then you are ready to use it. You can connect external monitor, mouse and a keyboard, and then you are ready to use the Raspberry Pi. But in this tutorial we want to control the Raspberry Pi remotely from our computer, so then we will choose and use the advanced options in this Raspberry Pi imager. So if you open the Raspberry Pi imager and select this configuration icon, these advanced options will pop up, and here you can specify and enable SSH, you can specify Wi-Fi network, etc. So this is the options that we are going to use in this tutorial to remotely set up and configure the Raspberry Pi and make it ready to use using a remote desktop connection. So let's start using the Raspberry Pi imager in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on the micro SD card. So here I'm on the raspberrypi.com web page, and then just go to the menu on top here, select software, and then you find information about the Raspberry Pi operating system and how to install the Raspberry Pi imager. So just download. If you're using a Windows computer, just click download for Windows, and then you will install the Raspberry Pi imager. And when you have installed it, you can just search for it, and then you find it in the menu in Windows. So no, yes. So basically this is the Raspberry Pi imager. This is the software that you use in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on this micro SD card. So now I am already plugged in a micro SD card using a micro SD adapter into my computer, so you find it here. Then I'm ready to just choose operating system, then I choose the default one, I choose storage, I select the micro SD card, and then I'm ready to write. And when this writing is finished, you can just unplug the micro SD card from your computer, plug it into the Raspberry Pi, then you can connect an external monitor, keyboard and a mouse, plug in the power supply, and then you're ready to use the Raspberry Pi operating system. But in this tutorial we will access Raspberry Pi remotely, so then instead of selecting write, I will select these advanced options which you find here. So then you have different options here. You can set a host name if you prefer, but since we are going to remotely access the Raspberry Pi, I need to select enable SSH. So I click here, use password authentication is okay, then set username and password. So then typically we can change the username, but the default one is Pi. I just leave it, and then I enter a proper password for my Raspberry Pi. Like this. Next, I want to configure a wireless LAN, so I just select this one. So I have, you can use whatever wireless network you want to use. I have set up a wireless hotspot on my Windows computer, which I'm going to use. So then I can just go to the settings in Windows and then select network and internet, then select mobile hotspot, then turn on mobile hotspot, and then you can create a name for your wireless network and a proper password. So my network is called Windows 10 HPH, which I will use here. And then I will enter my password. Like this. Wireless LAN country. You select the country you are part of. So I'm from Norway, so I select NO. So I set up my wireless network. I select the LAN country, which in my case is NO. Then we go further, set the local settings. So I'm in Europe, Oslo. The keyboard I'm having is a US keyboard, but basically we will not use a keyboard since we are going to use it remotely. So I guess that's all. So basically you need to enable SSH, and you need to set up a wireless connection, and then you just click save. And now you can click the right button here, and all existing data on this micro SD card will be erased. Do you want to continue? Yes. And then we just need to wait a few minutes in order to set up the micro SD card. So typically it will take a couple of minutes to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on this micro SD card. So finally it's ready. So Raspberry Pi has been written to the micro SD card, and now you can remove the SD card from the reader. So now I will remove the SD card from my computer and plug it into my Raspberry Pi, and then I will connect the Raspberry Pi with a power supply, and then boot the Raspberry Pi operating system, and then later I will show how you can remotely get access to the Raspberry Pi. So now I am using the Raspberry Pi imager in order to install the Raspberry Pi operating system on a micro SD card, and then I plugged in the micro SD card on the Raspberry Pi. I also power it up by plugging in a USB power supply, and then we are ready to take the next step. So now I will remotely get access to the Raspberry Pi using a software called PuTTy. So now I'm in my web browser. I'm here in the URL putty.org, and then download PuTTy. Click just the download PuTTy button, and then you can have different options here, but just select the PuTTy installation on top here. So then just select this one, and then you will download and install the PuTTy software. So then next I just search for PuTTy in my search bar, like this. I open the PuTTy software. So basically this is the PuTTy software. It's very simple to use. And also now I'm going to my mobile hotspot, which I set up in order to connect the Raspberry Pi. So this is the network that the Raspberry Pi is using, and then you see also here you get a list of all devices that are connected to this network. So then you see my Raspberry Pi is connected to this network, and then you also see the IP address for the Raspberry Pi here. So this information I will use when connecting to my Raspberry Pi using this PuTTy software. So let's go back to the PuTTy, and I just I open it once more. So then I just type the IP address here, which I found here in this list. So I can just copy it, put it here in the host name like this, and then basically just click open. And the first time you use PuTTy to connect to a new device, you get this this warning potentially security breach. So then just click accept, because now we are connecting to this Raspberry Pi and not to an external source. So just click accept, and now actually you are ready to use PuTTy, and you are ready to connect to the Raspberry Pi. So then log in as, and my username was Pi, which I set up in the Raspberry Pi imager. So then just click Pi and click enter, and the password like this, and click enter, and now I'm actually connected to my Raspberry Pi remotely using this PuTTy software. So the first thing you typically want to do is to make sure that the Raspberry Pi software is updated. So then you just type this command, sudo, is short for super user do, and then sudo apt update like this, and click enter. This command just make sure that the Raspberry Pi is updated with the latest version of the software, and then it takes some time to install the necessary and update the necessary packages. And when it's finished, you can type sudo apt full upgrade like this. So sudo apt full upgrade, hit enter, and then it will install and upgrade the necessary package. Do you want to continue? Yes, click enter, and then it will install and update these packages. Typically it takes some time to install these packages, but soon it will be updated. So now your Raspberry Pi has been updated with the latest versions of the different packages using this PuTTy software. In order to close or exit PuTTy, you can also just type exit command like this, and then the PuTTy will be closed. So far we have been using the PuTTy software in order to remotely connect to the Raspberry Pi, but the PuTTy software, with the PuTTy software you can only communicate using the terminal window on the Raspberry Pi. But next step is to actually communicate with the graphical desktop user interface on the Raspberry Pi. And in order to do that, we need to install something called VNC, which is short for Virtual Network Computing. So basically, on the Raspberry Pi, we need to install or actually enable the VNC server. It's already installed, but we need to enable it. So typically we use, if you are connected a monitor, keyboard and a mouse to our Raspberry Pi, we could use the terminal inside the Raspberry Pi operating system. But in our case, we will remotely do it using this PuTTy software. So then we just open PuTTy and then type the following command, sudo raspi config, and then we will just follow the information on the screen in order to enable VNC on the Raspberry Pi. So then we head back to the PuTTy software. So then since I just clicked exit last time, we need to establish a new connection to the Raspberry Pi. So then I just enter the IP address for the Raspberry Pi and click open. And then we are back in the PuTTy. I need to select my login, which was Pi in my case, and then the password for the Pi user. Like this, and now we are back and connected to the Raspberry Pi. So now, as mentioned, we need to enable this VNC server on the Raspberry Pi, because we need to enable this VNC server in order to connect using this remote desktop connection, so we can get access to the graphical desktop on the Raspberry Pi. So then I just type the following command, sudo raspi config like this, hit enter, and then you go into the Raspberry Pi configuration tool. I select interface options, click enter, and then we want to enable VNC. So then here, enable the VNC, the graphical remote access on the Raspberry Pi. Then I just click enter, and then would you like the VNC server to be enabled? I select yes, and the VNC server is enabled. I click just OK, and then basically I'm finished. So then I can just select finished here, and now we have enabled the VNC server on the Raspberry Pi. And the next step now would be to use the remote desktop connection in order to remotely connect to the desktop, the graphical user interface on the Raspberry Pi. So next we are ready to set up the remote desktop connection. So it's possible to connect to the Raspberry Pi remotely and see the graphical desktop. So first thing we need to do is to install a remote desktop connection server on the Raspberry Pi, so we are able to connect to that server from our PC. So then we need to install a software called XRDP, which is a free and open source implementation of the Microsoft Remote Desktop connection or desktop protocol server. So as mentioned, we need to have an RDP or RDC server installed on the Raspberry Pi in order to be able to connect to the Raspberry Pi remotely. So then in order to install this XRDP, we just enter the following: sudo apt get install XRDP. And since we are doing this remotely, we use the PuTTy software in order to run this command in order to install the XRDP. Of course, we could also connect to the Raspberry Pi itself with the external monitor, keyboard and a mouse, and use the terminal in order to install the XRDP software. So we are back in PuTTy, and we want to install this XRDP package, which is a free and open source remote desktop connection server that we need to install on the Raspberry Pi. So then you just type sudo apt get install and this XRDP like this, hit enter, and then this package will be installed on the Raspberry Pi. We click do you want to continue? Yes, hit enter, and then this package will be installed. So now the XRDP software is installed on the Raspberry Pi. So the next step is to create a new user that we need to use in order to connect to the Raspberry Pi using this remote desktop connection. Because we cannot use the built-in root user that we created earlier in the Raspberry Pi imager. So we need to create a new user in order to get access to the Raspberry Pi remotely using this remote desktop connection. So then we go back to the PuTTy, or we can of course use the terminal if we have access to the Raspberry Pi using a keyboard and a mouse. But typically you type just sudo add user and the new username. So basically that's it. So let's go back to PuTTy and add a new user to the Raspberry Pi. So we are back in PuTTy, then I just type sudo add user and the new username. I just create a new user called Pi remote desktop connection or something. Of course you can call it whatever you like. Click enter, and then you need to specify a password like this, hit enter and retype the new password like this, hit enter, and then you are asked for full name. I just use the default by clicking enter. You ask for a room number, I click just enter. Work phone, I just click enter. Home phone, I just click enter, and other, I just click enter. Is this information correct? Yes, I click enter, and now the new user has been added to the Raspberry Pi. if you want to use the Raspberry Pi and the general purpose input-output pins, you typically need to give the new user access to the general purpose input-output pins by using this command sudo add user and a new username, which is in this case Pi remote desktop connection. Of course, you can use whatever username you prefer, and then general purpose input output like this. Click enter, and now this new user called Pi RDC is added to the group general purpose input output. So by doing this, this new user has access to the general purpose input output pins on the Raspberry Pi. So now we have been creating a new user that we are going to use later when connecting to the Raspberry Pi using this remote desktop connection. We have also been giving this user access to the general purpose input output pins on the Raspberry Pi, but if you prefer, you can also give this user the same rights as the original root user of the system. So then you can type this very long command either in the terminal or in the PuTTy software. So then sudo usermod and the new username and all these settings. So then by typing this command, this new user will have almost the same right as the built-in root user of the Raspberry Pi. So I'm back in PuTTy, and I've entered this long command in order to give this new user the same rights as the built-in root user. So then sudo usermod, and this is the name of the user and all these parameters in order to give access to the entire system for this new user. And then I just hit enter, and then now this new user called PRRDC has almost the same right as the built-in user that we created earlier in this tutorial using this Raspberry Pi imager. So now we are ready to actually remotely connect to the Raspberry Pi user interface using this remote desktop connection. So then this remote desktop connection is built into the window. So then I just go to search, type remote desktop connection, and then I find this application, remote desktop connection. I just open it, and then I just need to type the IP address of the Raspberry Pi like this. I click connect, and then first time you get this warning, I just click yes, and then you are asked to log in to the Raspberry Pi with a username and a password. So then I use this new user which I have created and called PI RDC. Of course, you can create your own username, but my username is called PI RDC, and the password like this, and then I just click OK, and then after a few seconds I'm able to connect to the graphical user interface on the Raspberry Pi. So basically now here you see the graphical user interface on the Raspberry Pi. I'm asking for entering the password a second time. Authentication is required to refresh the system repositories. So then I just retype the password like this, click OK. So actually now we are good to go, and we are ready to start using the Raspberry Pi remotely from our desktop computer. So then I can click on the start menu here, which is a Raspberry icon. Then I can select programming, I can select the PuTTy Python environment, I can go to internet, I can select different tools like the terminal, file manager, etc. So basically we now have access to the Raspberry Pi remotely and can use all the features that are part of the Raspberry Pi operating system. Finally, in this video I will also show an alternative to using the remote desktop connection, namely a software package called VNC Viewer. So basically, VNC Viewer is an alternative to remote desktop connection, which I used for a few seconds ago. The remote desktop connection is included with Windows, but if you want to use this VNC Viewer, you need to download and install this software called VNC Viewer from this location. So here I'm on the home page of the company that creates this VNC Viewer. So then www.realvnc.com, and then I just select download and select the VNC Viewer here, and then I can choose to install it on Windows, Mac, etc. I have a Windows computer, so I select Windows and then just download VNC Viewer in order to download and install this package. So now I have installed the VNC Viewer. Then I just go to the search, type VNC, and then select this VNC Viewer application. It looks like this, and I just type the IP address for my Raspberry Pi. Like this. I click enter, and then connecting to this IP address. And hopefully after a few seconds I will be able to connect and see the graphical desktop of my Raspberry Pi using this VNC Viewer. Well, I had a problem. I of course typed the wrong IP address. It's not, it's 137 like this. Now I click enter, and now first time you get this warning. Are you absolutely sure that you want to connect to this VNC server? Yes. And then, as you see here, I now have access to my remote desktop and the Raspberry Pi desktop and graphical user interface using this VNC Viewer. And also by using this software instead of the remote desktop connection, I didn't have to use this or create this new user. I can use the built-in root user in this case, and I have access to all features on the Raspberry Pi, programming, the PuTTy, different applications like the terminal, etc. So here I have the terminal where you can enter commands similar to the commands we was using and writing in this PuTTy software. You have access to internet, etc. So basically, now I've shown two different ways to connect to the graphical user interface on Raspberry Pi. So first we used a remote desktop connection from Windows, which was built into the Windows operating system, and then the second alternative was using an external software called VNC Viewer, but both give the same access to the Raspberry Pi desktop environment like this. So let's summarize this tutorial. So we started to install the Raspberry Pi operating system using this Raspberry Pi imager. Then we could plug in the micro SD card into the Raspberry Pi and plug in an external monitor, keyboard, mouse, and a power supply, and then we could be ready to start using the Raspberry Pi. But assume that you don't have a monitor, you don't have a keyboard or a mouse. How can we set up and get remotely access to the Raspberry Pi? So then we use the advanced options in the Raspberry Pi imager to set up SSH and Wi-Fi, etc. Then it was installing and using the PuTTy software to get remote access to the terminal on the Raspberry Pi. Then we use this PuTTy to configure the Raspberry Pi by enabling VNC, because we need to enable VNC in order to remotely get access to the graphical user interface on the Raspberry Pi using this remote desktop connection. and he was also trying and using an alternative to this remote desktop connection called VNC Viewer software. So basically, that's all for now. So good luck with your Raspberry Pi. Thank you and goodbye.